She thought she was marrying into a dream, but it was the beginning of her nightmare. Lena never imagined that love could be the most dangerous mistake of her life. She wasn't looking for luxury or status, just a simple, honest life. But life had a cruel sense of humor. She was the kind of woman who fought her own battles, never waiting for anyone to save her. Struggling through long workdays, juggling bills, and carrying the weight of responsibilities, she never lost hope. She believed in kindness, in hard work, and that maybe, just maybe, love could be her escape. And then she met him. Charming, rich, a man who promised the world. But Lena had no idea. It wasn't just his heart she was marrying, it was his family's secrets, and they had plans for her she could never have imagined. It only takes a moment to meet someone who will change your life forever, or destroy it. Lena wasn't supposed to be there that day. It was just another ordinary afternoon, filled with the same routines she had grown used to, work, responsibilities, and quiet dreams tucked away in the corners of her heart. But fate doesn't follow routines. She was helping at a charity event, pouring coffee for strangers, her mind lost in thoughts of unpaid bills and late rent notices. That's when she met him, Omar. He didn't arrive like a storm, but more like a quiet shadow in the corner of the room. Sharp suit, perfectly polished shoes, and an aura that made people step aside without him asking. His presence wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. People whispered his name like it carried weight. That's Omar, the Arab millionaire. A man wrapped in mystery, power, and charm. Their eyes met across the room, just for a second. A glance that should have meant nothing. But for some reason, it felt like the air shifted. Lena didn't know who he was. She didn't care. She wasn't impressed by wealth or status. She was just trying to get through another long day. But Omar noticed her. Not because she was trying to be noticed, but because she wasn't. While others surrounded him, desperate for his attention, she was the only one who didn't seem to care. That's what caught his eye, her authenticity. He approached her, effortlessly charming, his voice smooth like velvet. "You don't seem impressed." She glanced at him, shrugged, and replied, "Should I be?" That was the moment, the spark, not from romance, but from curiosity. A man who had everything suddenly intrigued by a woman who needed nothing from him. They talked, laughed, genuine laughter, not the rehearsed kind he was used to. For Lena, he felt like an escape, someone who saw her beyond her struggles. For Omar, she was different, real, unpredictable. But what Lena didn't know was that fate doesn't give you gifts without a price, because sometimes the people who enter your life like a blessing are the ones who leave the deepest scars. It felt like a dream, until it wasn't. After their first encounter, Omar became a constant presence in Lena's life, like gravity pulling her into an orbit she never expected. He didn't just call, he arrived, with flowers that filled entire rooms, with handwritten notes tucked into places only someone truly observant would notice. He wasn't like other men. He made her feel seen. Omar's world was nothing like Lena's. While she was used to budgeting every penny, he lived without limits. Their first date wasn't at a local cafe. It was dinner on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline, under a sky full of stars that seemed brighter just for them. He didn't bring her roses. He flew her to places where roses grew wild, untouched and beautiful. Paris, Dubai, Santorini. Each trip more extravagant than the last, like pages torn from a fairy tale written just for her. Private jets, luxurious hotels, dinners under crystal chandeliers with views that stretched beyond the horizon. But amidst all the glamour, Omar's charm wasn't in his wealth. It was in the way he made Lena feel like she was the only woman in the world. He listened, not with the polite nods she was used to, but with genuine attention, as if her words were treasures he was collecting. He made promises, whispered in the quiet moments when no one else was around. "You deserve the world, Lena, and I'll give it to you." And she believed him. Because how could she not? Weeks felt like days, and soon their whirlwind romance spun faster than she could catch her breath. Until one evening, under a blanket of stars on a secluded beach, Omar knelt down, the waves crashing softly behind him, a ring in his hand that sparkled more than the night sky. "Marry me, Lena." Her heart raced, not because of the diamonds or the setting, but because of the way he looked at her like she was the missing piece of his world. Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear, but from overwhelming emotion. She said yes, her voice trembling with excitement and disbelief. But love, she would soon learn, is not measured by the grandness of gestures or the size of a ring. Sometimes, the most beautiful beginnings are just disguises for the darkest stories. Not every fairy tale ends with happily ever after. Some begin with a wedding and end with a nightmare. The day of the wedding arrived like a scene from a storybook, but one written with ink darker than Lena could ever imagine. The venue was breathtaking. An ancient palace turned into a masterpiece of lights, gold accents, and silk-draped arches. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above grand marble floors, and the scent of rare flowers filled the air, flown in from places Lena had never even heard of. Dignitaries, celebrities, royals. Faces she'd only seen in magazines were now applauding her entrance. Cameras flashed like stars, exploding in bursts of light, capturing a woman dressed in an exquisite gown, hand-stitched with jewels that glistened with every step she took. It was overwhelming, surreal, the kind of moment every girl dreams of, but dreams often hide shadows. As Lena walked down the aisle, her eyes met Omar's. He stood tall, dressed in a tailored suit, smiling with a charm that melted hearts. But it was when she looked beyond him, into the crowd, that she felt it. The cold stares. Omar's family sat in the front rows, their expressions masked under polite smiles, but their eyes betrayed them. Sharp, calculating, judging. Not with curiosity, but with quiet disdain. They didn't look at her like she was part of the family. They looked at her like she was an outsider who didn't belong. Lena brushed it off, convincing herself it was nerves. After all, weddings are stressful, especially in families as wealthy and powerful as Omar's. But the feeling wouldn't leave her. It clung to her like a shadow behind the silk of her veil. The ceremony continued, with vows whispered in soft voices, promises exchanged under the watchful eyes of people who clapped out of obligation, not joy. When Omar slid the ring onto her finger, his touch was warm, but something in his eyes flickered, gone in an instant like a cloud briefly covering the sun. At the reception, the grand hall transformed into a shimmering wonderland. Music, laughter, champagne flowing like rivers. Yet, despite the noise, Lena felt alone. She tried to connect with Omar's family, but their words were cold, wrapped in formality without warmth. Conversations ended when she approached. Smiles faded the moment she turned her back. Something was wrong, but she didn't know it yet. She thought she had married into love. What she really married into was a secret, a plan that had nothing to do with forever. She thought the wedding was the end of the fairy tale. She was wrong. It was just the beginning of the nightmare. After the wedding, Lena stepped into a world far beyond anything she'd ever known. The family estate wasn't just a home. It was an empire. A sprawling mansion nestled behind towering gates, surrounded by endless gardens trimmed with surgical precision. The marble floors gleamed so perfectly they reflected every step she took, and chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls of crystal, casting flickering shadows that felt more like silent watchers than simple decor. At first, Lena was overwhelmed, not just by the grandeur, but by the sheer emptiness of it all. The hallways stretched on endlessly, lined with portraits of stern ancestors, their painted eyes cold and lifeless. The air inside the estate was heavy, not with dust, but with something unspoken, something she couldn't name yet. Omar was her anchor, holding her hand as they walked through rooms filled with priceless artifacts and tapestries, older than any story she'd ever heard. But even his touch felt distant now, like he was present in body, but somewhere else in spirit. Then she met the family. They stood in the grand hall, waiting, perfectly poised, dressed in elegant traditional attire, their faces unreadable. Omar's mother was the first to step forward. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile that's been practiced in mirrors, sharp around the edges, brittle underneath. "Welcome to the family," she said softly, her voice warm, but her gaze icy cold. The others followed, brothers, sisters, cousins, all offering polite words, gestures of hospitality that felt rehearsed, mechanical. Not warmth, just performance. No one asked about Lena's family, her life, her dreams. Their questions were polite, yet hollow, like they were checking off a list of formalities rather than genuinely caring. Lena tried to shake off the discomfort. Maybe this was just how powerful families were, reserved, private. But deep down, something felt wrong. Days turned into weeks. Omar became increasingly busy with business affairs, leaving her alone in the vast emptiness of the estate. She explored room after room, each more magnificent than the last, but none felt like home. The staff, while respectful, avoided eye contact. Whispers floated behind closed doors, voices dropping to hushed tones the moment she entered. She wasn't a wife. She was a guest, one who had overstayed her welcome. And slowly, Lena realized that behind every polite smile was a secret, and beneath every gesture of hospitality was a hidden agenda. She just didn't know what it was. Yet. It's not the loud warnings that are the most dangerous. It's the whispers you're not supposed to hear. At first, Lena tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. The subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the way conversations would suddenly die when she entered a room. The quick glances exchanged between family members, sharp and fleeting like shadows darting across walls. But it wasn't her imagination. It started with small things, strange rules disguised as casual suggestions. "Oh, Lena, that wing of the house is under renovation. No need to go there." "The study? Omar prefers it to stay private. It's where important family documents are kept." At first, Lena nodded, respecting boundaries. But the estate was massive, with endless hallways that seemed to stretch deeper than they should, doors that were always locked, and rooms she was subtly told were off-limits. Why would a home have places forbidden to the woman who lived there? Her curiosity grew, especially during the long days when Omar was gone, buried in business meetings. The mansion felt like a puzzle she wasn't meant to solve, its beauty hiding cracks beneath the surface. Then came the whispers. Late at night, when the halls were empty and the silence too loud, Lena heard voices, hushed tones leaking through thin walls, tense, urgent. Whenever she tried to get closer, the voices would vanish, like they were never there. She'd catch fragments of sentences, "She doesn't suspect yet," or "We just need a little more time." Enough to stir unease, but not enough to piece together the full picture. One evening she walked past Omar's office, a room she was specifically told not to enter. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Omar was speaking to his mother, their voices low but sharp with tension. "She's asking too many questions. Handle it. We can't afford mistakes." Lena froze. Were they talking about her? The air felt colder, heavier, pressing against her chest. She retreated quietly, her heart racing, not just with fear but with realization. This wasn't about overprotective family dynamics. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The fairy tale was unraveling, and beneath it was a truth she wasn't supposed to find. But she would, even if it destroyed her. Sometimes the loneliest place isn't an empty room. It's standing beside someone who's supposed to love you. Omar changed. It wasn't sudden like a storm. It crept in quietly, like a shadow stretching longer with each passing day. The warmth in his eyes faded, replaced by a cold indifference she couldn't explain. The man who once whispered promises under starlit skies now spoke in clipped sentences, distracted and distant. "I'm busy, Lena. I have important matters to handle." "Not now, Lena. This isn't something you'd understand." His words weren't cruel, but they were sharp enough to leave invisible scars. Days turned into weeks. Omar's presence became rare, and when he was home, he was there in body, not in heart. He spent hours locked in his office, emerging only for formal family dinners where Lena felt more like a guest than a wife. Conversations at the table were filled with coded words and empty pleasantries, always circling around her but never including her. She tried reaching out to her friends, her family back home, but her calls went unanswered. When she questioned the staff, they'd politely claim there were technical issues with the lines. Her phone mysteriously malfunctioned, messages never sent, emails lost in drafts. She was cut off, one thread at a time, until she was completely alone. The mansion, once awe-inspiring, felt like a gilded cage, a prison with velvet walls. Lena roamed its endless hallways, passing doors that stayed locked, rooms that whispered secrets she wasn't allowed to hear. The staff avoided her gaze, their faces blank masks of obedience. When she confronted Omar, desperate for answers, he dismissed her concerns with practiced ease. "You're being paranoid, Lena. Maybe you need some rest." But she knew it wasn't in her head. She could feel it, the walls closing in, the invisible chains tightening. Lena wasn't a wife anymore. She was an ornament, something pretty to display but never heard. And in the quiet spaces of her isolation, she began to understand. She didn't marry into a family. She married into a trap. The truth doesn't whisper. It screams when you're finally ready to hear it. Lena had stopped expecting answers. She'd learned to live with the silence, to walk the halls of the estate like a shadow, unseen and unheard. But fate has a way of unraveling secrets when you least expect it. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, if anything in her life could still be called ordinary. Omar had left in a rush, forgetting to lock his office door. The room she was never allowed to enter. The room that held more than just business contracts. Curiosity wasn't what pulled her in. It was survival. She stepped inside, the door creaking slightly as if protesting her presence. The room smelled of leather and power. The heavy mahogany desk stacked with files, papers neatly arranged, too neat, like someone hiding chaos beneath order. Her hands trembled as she opened a drawer, finding folders stamped with the family crest. Contracts, financial statements, documents she couldn't fully understand until she saw her name. Her heart raced. She unfolded the papers, her eyes scanning words that blurred before snapping into sharp focus. Marriage agreement, strategic alliance, asset consolidation. The words felt like knives. Page after page detailed the truth. She was part of a deal. Her marriage wasn't about love. It was about power, wealth, control. Her name wasn't written with affection. It was filed alongside property agreements and investment mergers. But the final blow came when she found Omar's signature. Not just once. Everywhere. He knew. He knew all along. The memories came flooding back. His charm, his perfect words, the whirlwind romance. None of it was real. She wasn't chosen. She was purchased. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of betrayal crushed her chest. The man she thought was her partner, her safe place, had been the architect of her cage. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Because in that moment, Lena realized something even more powerful than the betrayal. They thought they owned her. But they had no idea who she truly was. And she was about to show them. Betrayal doesn't always come with lies. Sometimes it's buried in the truths they never told you. Lena didn't wait. The papers clutched tightly in her trembling hands were more than evidence. They were the final threads snapping in the fragile illusion of her marriage. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with fury. The kind that burns quietly, hot enough to sear through denial. She found Omar in his private lounge, glass of aged whiskey in hand, his expression relaxed, untouched by the chaos unraveling inside her. Without hesitation, she threw the documents onto the polished glass table. "Explain this." Omar glanced down, his face a mask carved from stone. No shock, no panic. Just a small sigh, like she was a child making a fuss over something trivial. "I told you not to go into my office, Lena." His voice was calm, too calm. The warmth she once found comfort in was gone, replaced by icy indifference. This, Lena's voice cracked, emotion tangled with rage. This isn't just paperwork, Omar. This is my life, my marriage. Was any of it real? He set down his glass, leaning back, eyes narrowing slightly. Real is a subjective term. A smirk played at the corner of his mouth, not out of humor but arrogance, like her pain was an inconvenience. Lena's heart shattered, not just from his words, but from the realization that the man she had loved was a stranger in disguise. So, I was just part of the deal? She whispered, her voice soft but shaking. Omar shrugged. You were perfect for it. Smart enough to seem impressive, naive enough to fall for it. No remorse, no regret. Just the cold, clinical assessment of someone who had never seen her as more than a pawn on his chessboard. The tears she fought so hard to hold back blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. Not anymore. I loved you, she whispered, more to herself than to him. He stood, straightened his cuffs, and said quietly, and that's what made it easy. Those words carved deeper than any lie he'd ever told. In that moment, Lena realized the heartbreaking truth. She wasn't betrayed by an enemy. She was destroyed by the man who promised to protect her. But betrayal has a strange way of birthing strength, and Omar had no idea what he had just unleashed. Betrayal breaks some people, but for others, it builds a fire they never knew existed. Lena stared at the door long after Omar left, his words lingering like poison in the air. The echo of his cold dismissal rang louder than her own heartbeat. But something shifted inside her, not the weight of defeat, but the spark of defiance. She thought about the life she had before him, the struggles she faced, the battles she fought when no one believed in her. She had survived storms long before Omar came into her life. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't weak. She had simply forgotten her own strength in the shadows of his lies. But now she remembered. Sitting alone in the grand, empty room that once felt like a palace, Lena wiped away the tears, not out of weakness, but as if erasing the last traces of the woman who believed in Omar's love. That woman was gone. What remained was someone new, someone stronger, someone dangerous, because she had nothing left to lose. She didn't scream. She didn't confront the family with wild accusations. Revenge isn't loud. It's quiet, calculated, and patient. And Lena was done playing the naive wife. Her silent rebellion began with small steps. She started observing, not as a confused outsider, but as someone searching for cracks in the fortress. Conversations she once ignored now held clues. Locked doors weren't barriers anymore. They were invitations. She discovered hidden documents, financial records masked as charitable donations but tied to corrupt dealings. She overheard whispered conversations behind closed doors, plans involving not just her, but others like her, women used as pawns in power games, disguised as marriages. She kept a journal, writing down every detail, names, dates, transactions. Her phone, once a useless ornament, became her secret weapon, recording voices in the dark, capturing photos of evidence Omar's family thought was buried. Every smile she gave was a mask. Every polite nod was a strategy. She wasn't surviving anymore, she was planning. Because Omar's biggest mistake wasn't marrying her for a business deal. It was underestimating her. In a house full of enemies, even the faintest whisper of an ally can sound like hope. Lena had grown used to the silence of the estate, the kind that suffocated, not soothed. But it was in that silence she heard something different one night. A quiet knock, faint, hesitant. Not the bold, entitled footsteps of Omar or his family. Something softer, almost afraid. She opened the door to find Noura, a housemaid who'd always kept her distance, eyes cast down like the rest of the staff. But tonight, her gaze met Lena's with something different, fear, and maybe something more. You need to be careful, Noura whispered, her voice trembling but firm. They're watching you. Lena's heart raced. She'd spent weeks gathering pieces of a puzzle she couldn't fully understand. But now, standing in the dim light of her room, was someone holding a missing piece. Nora wasn't just a maid. She had been working for the family long before Lena arrived. She'd seen everything, heard everything, and she knew what Lena was just beginning to uncover. "You're not the first," Nora confessed, her eyes dark with secrets. "And you won't be the last." She spoke of other women, brides, who were brought into the family not for love but for power. Women who had disappeared quietly, their stories erased, their voices silenced. Some left with nothing, some didn't leave at all. Lena felt a chill, but fear had no place left in her heart. She wasn't going to be another forgotten name. Together, they formed a fragile alliance. Nora became Lena's eyes and ears, slipping her keys to locked rooms, smuggling out documents, passing on whispered conversations from the family's inner circle. The more Lena learned, the clearer the plan became. Escape wasn't enough. She didn't just want freedom. She wanted justice. She mapped out every detail. The family's financial secrets, their illegal dealings, evidence that could destroy everything they'd built on manipulation and greed. Omar thought he had control over her life, but he never anticipated that the woman he underestimated would be the one to dismantle his empire. Lena wasn't plotting an escape, she was planning their downfall. The best revenge isn't silence, it's the truth, spoken so loudly that even the lies can't drown it out. The estate was alive with grandeur that night, a celebration thrown by Omar's family, attended by the elite, politicians, and influential business tycoons. The perfect stage, Lena realized, to pull back the curtain on the carefully crafted illusion they called a family. She walked into the grand hall wearing a simple, elegant dress, not adorned with jewels, but with something far more powerful: the truth. Her heart raced, but not with fear. It was adrenaline, the steady pulse of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to expose. The room buzzed with polite laughter, champagne flutes clinking, and hollow conversations. Omar stood at the center, charming as ever, surrounded by people who praised him with smiles as fake as the life he'd built. But that night, Lena wasn't invisible. She stepped onto the stage meant for speeches about legacy and success, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I have something to say." The room fell into an uneasy silence, all eyes turning to her. Omar's smile froze, his charm cracking just slightly, as he realized she wasn't there to play the role of the perfect wife. "I came into this family thinking I was marrying into love," Lena began, her voice steady. "But love was never part of the plan, was it?" She pulled out the documents she'd gathered, evidence of their corruption, fraudulent deals, and the dark truth behind their so-called empire. Names, numbers, dates. The room shifted from curiosity to disbelief, whispers spreading like wildfire. Omar's face darkened. He stormed towards her, his mask of charm replaced by pure fury. "Enough, Lena," he hissed, trying to snatch the papers from her hand, but Lena didn't flinch. "No, Omar, you don't get to control this narrative anymore." His threats came next, quiet, sharp, meant to intimidate. "You don't know what you're doing." But she did. She knew exactly what she was doing. "You thought you owned me," she said, her voice rising above the tension. "But you were wrong. I was never yours to control." Gasps echoed as Lena revealed not just the family's crimes but Omar's betrayal, the business deals disguised as marriage, the women before her who'd been silenced. The crowd's silence was deafening, but Lena's courage roared louder. Omar stood there, powerless for the first time in his life, surrounded by the wreckage of the empire he'd tried to build on lies. And Lena? She didn't just walk away. She walked out victorious, free, fearless, and finally heard. Sometimes walking away isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of your freedom. The echoes of Lena's words still lingered in the grand hall as she stood, staring into the stunned faces of people who once saw her as nothing more than a decoration beside Omar. The documents lay scattered across the floor, exposing every dark secret the family had fought to keep hidden. But Lena didn't need to say another word. The truth had already done its job. Omar stood frozen, fury burning in his eyes. but powerless to stop her. For a man who thrived on control, that was his ultimate defeat, knowing he had lost the one thing he thought he owned. Without another glance, Lena turned away, not just from Omar, but from everything. The mansion, the wealth, the status. All the things she once thought were part of her new life now felt like chains she was finally breaking. As she stepped out of the estate, the cold night air met her skin, but for the first time in a long time, she felt warmth. Not from luxury, but from freedom. She walked through the gates with nothing but herself, no jewels, no fortune, no title, but she had her dignity, her strength, her story. The sun was rising, casting a soft glow over the horizon, painting the sky in colors she hadn't noticed in years. It felt like the universe itself was applauding her escape. Lena took a deep breath. The weight she'd carried for so long finally lifted. The fear, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it was still there, but it didn't define her anymore. She wasn't the woman who had been used and manipulated. She was the woman who fought back, who spoke up, who walked away. With every step she took, she reclaimed pieces of herself that had been buried under lies. And with each step she felt lighter, stronger, reborn. Because true freedom isn't about leaving behind a place, it's about leaving behind everything that was never meant for you. She lost everything they gave her, but gained everything they couldn't take. Lena's new life didn't start with grand gestures or dramatic moments. It began quietly, in a small, sunlit apartment far from the towering walls of Omar's estate. No marble floors, no silk sheets, just simplicity and peace. She had nothing material to her name, no wealth, no status, no connections. But for the first time in years, she had herself. The mornings were different now. She woke up not to the sound of distant luxury cars or hollow footsteps in cold hallways, but to the soft glow of sunlight creeping through her modest curtains. And that was enough. But Lena wasn't meant to just survive. She was meant to rise. She took her pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the humiliation, and did something remarkable with it. She turned it into purpose. Lena started a small organization, not with investors or big speeches, but with a simple mission: to help women who felt trapped like I once did. She named it The Second Chapter, a place where women could find not just support, but strength. Not just shelter, but the courage to rebuild. She worked tirelessly, meeting survivors of emotional abuse, manipulation, and control, women whose stories mirrored her own. She listened, she learned, and most importantly, she fought. Not with bitterness, but with the fierce belief that no one deserved to feel powerless. Her organization grew slowly at first, then faster as word spread. She held workshops, spoke at events, and became a voice for the voiceless. People didn't admire her because she had escaped Omar's world. They admired her because she had transformed her scars into something beautiful. Lena's past wasn't a chain anymore. It was her armor. She was no longer the woman who had been trapped in a golden cage. She was the woman who had built her own castle, brick by brick, word by word, life by life. And in every woman she helped, she saw a reflection of herself. Not the broken version, but the one who chose to fight back. She wasn't just a survivor. She became the story they could never silence. Lena's name, once whispered in the shadows of scandal, was now spoken with admiration and respect. She had become more than just a woman who escaped. She became a symbol. News outlets began picking up her story, not as gossip fodder, but as a beacon of resilience. Interviews followed, not because she sought fame, but because her voice carried a message the world desperately needed to hear. You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become after. She stood on stages she never imagined, addressing rooms filled with people from all walks of life: politicians, activists, survivors, dreamers. Her words weren't rehearsed. They were raw, carved from the pain she once thought would break her. I lost everything I thought defined me: money, status, love. But in losing all of that, I found the one thing I never had: myself. Her face graced magazine covers, not as a trophy wife or a scandal survivor, but as a warrior in her own right. She didn't wear crowns or diamonds anymore. She wore her scars with pride. Each one a reminder of battles fought and won. Social media flooded with hashtags like Stand with Lena, Break the Chains, Second Chapter Movement. She wasn't just Lena anymore. She was a movement. Young girls wrote to her, women found courage through her story, and even men who had felt powerless in different ways found strength in her resilience. Her story crossed borders, languages, and cultures, because pain and hope are universal. But amidst the applause and recognition, Lena remained grounded. She never forgot the woman she used to be, the one standing alone in a cold mansion, thinking she had no way out. That memory fueled her fire, and when asked what kept her going, she simply said, "Because somewhere out there, another woman thinks she's trapped. I want her to know she's not." Lena didn't just reclaim her life, she became the light for others to find theirs. The truth doesn't need an army, it just needs time. As Lena's star rose, the cracks in Omar's family's empire began to spread like wildfire, silent at first, then impossible to ignore. What was once a fortress of power, influence, and untouchable wealth slowly crumbled under the weight of their own secrets. The documents Lena had exposed weren't just about her. They were the first thread pulled from a tapestry woven with lies, fraud, and corruption. Investigations followed. Journalists dug deeper. Whispers turned into headlines splashed across every major news outlet. Elite family faces, financial scandal, hidden crimes exposed. The dark truth behind the wealth, a story of manipulation and control. Lawsuits piled up. Business deals collapsed. Allies turned into enemies as people scrambled to distance themselves from the disgrace. The family who once wore their reputation like armor now found it shattered, piece by piece. And then there was Omar. The man who once stood tall, untouchable, now watched from the shadows as everything he built fell apart. His charm, once his greatest weapon, was useless. No one admired him anymore. The same people who had laughed at his jokes, shaken his hand, and envied his life, now crossed the street to avoid him. But nothing haunted Omar more than Lena's face. Not the woman he'd tried to control. Not the wife he'd thought was weak. But the woman who stood without him, and shined. He saw her on TV, speaking to crowds larger than he'd ever commanded. He heard her words, strong, fearless, inspiring. Words that had nothing to do with him, but everything to do with what she'd become after him. And that was the final punishment, not the lost fortune, not the ruined legacy, but the realization that he could never break her. Omar was left with nothing but regret, a ghost of a man haunted not by what he had lost, but by what he could never control. A woman who never needed him to be whole. Sometimes, the most powerful chapters are written after the story you thought was over. Years had passed. The noise, the headlines, the scandals, they had all faded like distant echoes. But Lena's story wasn't measured by the chaos she survived. It was defined by the woman she became after. She stood by a window in her modest home, overlooking a world she had rebuilt, not from luxury, but from resilience. There were no gold-framed photos of lavish weddings, no reminders of the life she left behind. Instead, there were letters from women she had helped, pictures of lives she'd touched, and scars she wore with pride, not on her skin, but etched into her strength. She thought about Omar sometimes, not with bitterness but with clarity. You were a chapter, she'd whisper to herself, but not the whole story, because she was never defined by the love she lost. She was defined by the courage it took to lose it, and still choose herself. Lena sat quietly, reflecting on the girl she used to be. The one who thought love was enough. The one who believed promises without questioning their price. The one who mistook a gilded cage for a palace. But now she smiled, not because her life was perfect, but because she had written every word of her story herself. She turned to the camera, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of every battle she'd won. If you're watching this, wondering if you're enough, if you're strong enough to walk away, If your worth depends on who stays or who leaves, let me tell you something. She leaned forward, her eyes fierce yet kind. Your worth isn't defined by who loves you, but by how deeply you love and respect yourself. Because Lena's story wasn't just about survival, it was about becoming, and she became everything they thought she'd never be. Free, whole, unstoppable. If Lena's journey inspired you, don't forget to like this video to show your support for stories that celebrate strength and resilience. Comment below. What lesson did you take from Lena's story? Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about courage, self-discovery, and overcoming life's toughest challenges. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that your worth isn't defined by who loves you, but by how deeply you love and respect yourself. Love,